Hello. In this video, I'll be doing a bit of an in-depth discussion of the themes and kind of, I guess you'd say, Easter eggs of Terry Pratchett's book, Going Postal. So, just first of all, really quickly, this book is really good, and I strongly recommend you read it. And this video is probably better suited for people who have read it, but honestly, if you haven't read it, you could still listen to this and hopefully get something out of it. I do have a review of it on my channel, so check that out if you're interested. But yeah, so this book has a lot of very kind of in-depth sort of themes, a lot of them often very political or like directly, in reference to economical things that happen in our world, economic things that happen in our world. And then there's also some kind of random niche stuff as well, some themes to do with redemption and these sort of things. So I think I'll just kind of, jump straight into it. So I think one of the major themes of this book, as I just said, is redemption. So our main character, Moist van Lipwig, he was like a confidence trickster, a scammer, essentially, and he made lots of money doing this, but he never really cared about the money as such. He just kind of did it for fun because he thought he could, and he could, to be fair. And this kind of book kind of follows his sort of redemption arc, so to speak, right, where he uses these talents that he has from being a confidence trickster and such. He uses them for good. He gets put into civic service, running a post office, and he has to kind of use all the stuff that he's kind of been on the dark side of to bring value to his city and to people. And it's very interesting seeing, we see the inside of his mind as he's doing this, right, where he's actually, kind of enjoying putting it to good use, because he never actually really cared about making money by scamming people. He just wanted to do it because he thought he could. And so he creates like positive scams, he makes everybody believe in this dream of this, this functioning post office. And so I think if we kind of, so that's kind of there, in plain text, essentially. But if we kind of think about what this might say about what Terry Pratchett believes about redemption, I think that perhaps he's trying to say something that, like, if you are able to, turn your talents towards good, right? And, if you've done bad stuff in your life, if you're able to give back to society and give back to other people, you'll find, you'll be able to forgive yourself, and you'll be able to, society will be able to forgive you as well. And I suppose you could argue that the metaphor for society here is Lord Vetinari, right? Because he is, in charge of a society, and he eventually sort of forgives Moist at the end when he, the parole officer, the giant golem, sort of leaves him as like, well, I'm off to do some other stuff now, because you're no longer actually on parole. You've been re-entered into society, which you could kind of see as he's done all these good actions, and now society, Lord Vetinari, everybody's sort of forgiven him, and he's also been able to forgive himself. And to be fair, the self-forgiveness thing isn't very in-depth explored. We do get a mention of how the golem calculates that he's killed like 2.6 people via his actions, scamming people losing money, people losing their jobs, this sort of stuff. And we get a little bit of a brief exploration of that, but Moist is kind of able to distract himself by doing good. And I think you could argue that that's sort of a big part of the whole book, right? Which is that he's able to distract himself from bad stuff he's done by doing good, So yeah, that's like that kind of theme of redemption that gets explored. I guess I'll move on now to something a bit more economic, which is that this story seems to be very strongly against sort of like large corporate capitalism, and we kind of see this in quite a few different ways. So obviously our main kind of antagonist in the story is Reacher Guilt and his grand trunk line, these semaphore towers, essentially signaling towers, beacons, if you will, that transmit transmit messages. Think giant Morse code towers, essentially. And he's kind of our big antagonist because these towers, this system was developed by a bunch of like engineers who knew what they were doing and cared about it, and eventually he kind of bought it up out from under them and kind of scammed them out of the business, and he took over, and then he's kind of been running the business into the ground. And it's interesting because he's actually everybody thinks they're scamming each other because the board of directors thinks they're making money by embezzling the company, which they are, but then Reach Guild is planning on embezzling them. And of course, the guy that loses at the end of the day is the other workers of the company and people trying to send messages. We hear a lot of stuff about how, if you try and, contact their customer service, you just get told, we're sorry about the delays, which you'd have to think is a pretty direct, sort of comparison to a lot of companies in the modern world, if you're talking phone companies or insurance companies that keep you on hold for about 1 million years. And I think this is really interesting that we kind of get this very direct criticism of the system. We see how these people are like very morally bankrupt and actually don't care about, about the consequences of their actions. People are dying in these towers because, they don't get the adequate rest. They don't get the, there's no skilled people anymore because they're all fired because they're just trying to make money. And I think we see from Terry Pratchett here a pretty direct criticism of like direct corporate capitalism, with a profit motive exclusively. But we also, I suppose, you could argue a defense of it as well, because at the end of the book, Lord Veterinary intends on taking this company into civic ownership, into public ownership, and Moist, our main character, is like, no, it should go back to the hands of the people who built it, the people who know how it works, the people who are passionate about it, these people. And I suppose what you could see here is maybe a strong argument for kind of government-protected capitalism, so to speak, which is that, the small business owner is protected by the government and protected from these large corporate interests. But it is interesting as well, because one thing that Terry Pratchett kind of fails to address a little bit is that the reason this trunk line was able to develop, this big company was able to develop, is because of the finance from these guys who eventually kind of took it out from under them. And so he doesn't necessarily provide a great alternative for this venture capital, essentially. He doesn't necessarily explain where in this system he is arguably proposing. He doesn't necessarily explain where people will get money to start these big companies. But you could argue that his point is that it would come from government, but not necessarily explicitly kind of stated. And that leads me into one other sort of criticism you could have of Terry Pratchett's worldview here, is that he's trying to convince us that the post office is so good because it's government run and it's efficient and the government was able to put someone smart in charge of it, and this is true. But if you actually see it, when the post office burns down, we're explicitly told that the government doesn't have enough tax dollars to build it up again, right? And people would be unwilling to do that, and so our main character, in quite a funny scene, he uses the money he earned from all his crimes to pay back into society, right? Which is a good redemption moment for him, going back to that previous theme. But it doesn't necessarily feed into this theme of, we're supposed to be told that the government is more efficient and government will be able to rebuild and stuff. But the money to rebuild actually doesn't come from government; it comes from this guy's personal gain. So it doesn't actually help us understand how, the government would deal with these big setbacks. That perhaps somebody with a lot of venture capital would be able to deal with, right? Because if there's a profit motive, then you could argue that somebody would just rebuild it anyway. But that's an aside there. And then we also get quite a lot of criticism of kind of corporate doublespeak and like governmental doublespeak, where we hear these words being misused by this company, talking about their synergistic core values and their key competencies and how they're people driven and all this stuff. And we get kind of a little bit beaten over the head with how pointless and painful this sort of language is, and how we get quite a fun metaphor, where we're told that these words are whoring themselves out, and he tells us that synergistically was probably already a whore. And I think that's an interesting point he's making, that some of these words, the way they're used by corporations, they don't actually mean anything anymore, and people will just kind of take them in and move on. And that's definitely something I can say that I've experienced in my life. Where you sometimes hear people saying some very, they say a lot of words and they sound very good, but they don't actually mean anything. So really they're saying nothing, So that was some interesting stuff there. And then some of the other stuff I picked apart was there's some kind of themes of tyranny versus democracy, or versus anything, versus freedom. And this is something I've talked about before. I have a video on the political philosophy of the City Watch series, also Terry Pratchett in the same universe. And I don't want to retread too much of that same ground there, so I'll probably link that in the description. But it's the same idea where it's like, to what extent is a tyrannical government, is an overly powerful government actually a good thing? And it's interesting that Terry Pratchett seems to come down quite hard on the side that it actually is a relatively good thing. For example, in this story, we see at the end of the story, Lord Veterinary, the leader of the city, he takes into custody all these, these people who have committed these embezzlement and stuff in his company. And when they question him and they say, on what charge? He says, I'm a tyrant, remember? And this is taken in the story to be a good thing, right? Which is that his tyranny has allowed him to, just sort out the problem. And this is definitely an argument that many people have put forward in the past for more autocratic forms of government, right? Which is that they can get stuff done. If people are committing crimes, or what, even though it's not technically legally a crime, people don't know it's a crime. If the government knows it's a crime, then they can just quickly deal with it, and it's all well and good. And this is, like I said, this is an argument that's been presented many times. However, it does inevitably lead into the problem that, with a tyrant, there can be tyranny, which is to say that they might be doing this to people who don't actually deserve it. Perhaps people that oppose them, or people that disagree with the government for legitimate reasons. And so, I think in this book where, the tyranny and autocracy are treated with kid gloves, so to speak, which is that Terry Pratchett takes a very soft stance on the problems that, a lot of people in the modern world, have with tyranny. Most people, would call themselves Democrats, right, would be in favor of democracy. And Terry Pratchett seems to be almost opposed to that, or at the very least creating some really focusing on the positive side of autocratic government. And I have to say, I'm not totally in disagreement with him, and I think he makes some, relevant points. And you can see how a more strong government can actually get things done in the story. So it's not like he's totally out of left field or anything. But it is interesting that he's so sort of that he kind of makes this point, and it's something that happens in this book, and also kind of repeatedly in the in the City Watch series as well, which I'll link my video about that as well. I'm just I have to say that this book is very kind of ripe with a lot of themes. Another one, we talk about, on economic grounds, is we get this idea of paper money, and what that actually means. What money actually is about. And this is something that Terry Pratchett actually quite likes exploring. He explores it in the next book, Making Money, which is just about all about this theme, but he kind of touches on it a little bit here, where Moist, my main character, Moist Von Lipvig, who's in charge of Post Office, he introduces postal stamps, which we all know, and essentially people start using them as paper money, and we get just kind of a little brief kind of discussion of what this actually means, right? And Lord Vetinari touches on this at the end, where he's talking about how, people are finally starting to get past the idea that money should be shiny. It's actually just paper. It's just a dream. It's a fantasy, and we actually get this directly told to us, kind of in the latter, I want to say, few pages of the book, where we get kind of repeatedly kind of told about how this idea, this of finance and embezzlement and stuff only works. This idea of all these big companies and stuff only works because we believe it works. And so we get talked about how these people who, the big financiers of a city, the people who are in charge of the money, they actually don't like Reacher Guild and what he's done, because he kind of brings into question people's trust in the system, in money, in finance, and how, they actually put out a hit on him. They want him assassinated because he's making the whole system look bad. And the reason they're concerned about this is because they believe that, the whole thing is just really a fantasy. And I think this is something that Terry Pratchett he's touched on kind of repeatedly, and he seems very interested in this idea of to what extent is money and finance actually real, and to what extent is it us just all kind of collectively dreaming that it's real. And this is something that, many philosophers have talked about in the past, right? This idea of, I have $5 and I can exchange that for, say, some sushi, right? The sushi is real, it's corporeal, I can eat it, I can do something with it. But $5, outside of what other people think about it, is not actually real, it doesn't actually mean anything. However, in my personal beliefs here, I don't think this discussion is as profound as people think it is, because many things are only real in the context of how humans understand them, right? You can talk about emotions or anything like that. Anything ethereal is only really real in our experience anyway. So I don't necessarily think this discussion is as profound as some people think it is, but I do still think it's something interesting to explore. And I think that what we can kind of conclude from this whole book is that Terry Pratchett is essentially a master of using fantasy and using the tropes of fantasy and playing around with them to kind of explore theme and explore his perspectives, both economic, political, and moral. So if we can see these themes that we've been through here, we've been through political themes, autocracy versus democracy, to what extent tyranny is a good thing versus a bad thing. We've been through economic themes, paper money, what that means, what people's understanding of finance means, corporations, and if they're a good thing or a bad thing, private capital versus government capital. And then we've also been through moral themes as well, like redemption and this sort of thing. So I think that Terry Pratchett really is a master of kind of exploring these. And I'm not actually sure to what extent I'm being just an English teacher and reading into things, and to what extent he intends this to be a part of a book. I definitely think that the redemption thing may be accidental. I might just be reading into that, I might be pulling the English teacher, the curtains were blue, what does it mean, sort of thing. But I definitely think that the paper money, the finance side of things, is a very explicit theme, and something that he's very deliberately trying to explore, because he talks about it. We have characters discussing it and questioning it, and when I do a similar video like this about Making Money, which is the next book, I'm sure I'll be talking about this a lot more. But I definitely think this is something Terry Pratchett wants us to think about. And I think a similar thing can be said of his, tyranny versus autocracy, tyranny versus democracy idea, which I actually really think he does want us to think about, because we're kind of beaten over the head with his idea that Vetinari is a tyrant, and we're kind of presented as this is largely a good thing. But I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that maybe gave you something to think about regarding this book, and I also hope that it hopefully prompted you to reread the book if you have read it before, or pick it up if you haven't. But thanks very much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.